just the beginning.
The flash of the blast didn't illuminate the room. It scorched it. The deafening metallic roar of a 12-gauge shotgun tore through the suffocating humidity of the Hidden Garden District safe house, leaving the acrid, choking stench of black powder hanging in the air like gray moss. Evangeline didn't flinch. Her deep-set, guarded, dark eyes remained locked on Chase as his grip on the revolver faltered, his shoulder exploding in a spray of dark crimson as the lead pellets shredded his seersucker jacket. He staggered backward, his gun firing blindly into the mahogany ceiling before he capsized over a velvet armchair. In the doorway, framed by the jagged lightning of the New Orleans storm, stood Silas St. James. His large hands were clamped around the smoking steel barrel of the shotgun, his weathered face twisted into an expression of raw, unadulterated biblical wrath. "Abomination," Silas whispered, his voice trembling with the flicker of his old pulpit power, though whether he meant the bleeding man on the floor or the daughter standing in front of him remained unsaid. Evangeline stepped over Chase's groaning form, her emerald green silk gown tracking through the fresh blood expanding across the floorboards. She didn't look at her father. Her gaze dropped to the sofa, where Julian Vane lay slumped on his side. His rich bronze skin had turned an ashen, translucent gray, his elegant silk shirt soaked through with a deep, dark bloom of blood from the puncture wound in his chest. "Eva," Julian choked out, a thin crimson bubble expanding past his lips and popping against his silver-streaked mustache. "The ledger. Don't let them take the registry codes." The front double doors didn't open. They were obliterated inward by the massive physical bulk of Grady the Gator Miller. His heavy gold rings glinted under the flashing red and blue strobe of distant police cruisers as he evaluated the wreckage of the room with an icy, mercenary precision. Behind him, Trixie Belle Fontaine rushed into the space, her vibrant canary-yellow trench coat billowing like a warning sail in the storm. "We got 3 minutes before Vance's precinct boys seal the perimeter, boss," Grady growled, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated the window panes. He reached down, hoisting Julian's limp body over his massive shoulder as effortlessly as a sack of grain. "Chase's runners are regrouping by the canal. We gotta move now." The black sedan cut through the heavy, low-hanging fog of the Tremé district, its headlights slicing weak yellow tunnels through the downpour. Evangeline sat in the rear seat, Julian's silver-streaked head resting heavily in her lap. Her long, slender mahogany fingers were pressed flat against his chest, trying to hold the fragments of his life together beneath the silk. Across from her sat Silas, his shotgun resting between his knees like an iron boundary marker. "You should have let him kill me, Silas," Evangeline said, her rich contralto voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic register that cut through the sound of the windshield wipers. "It would have saved you the trouble of holding a second funeral in your heart." Silas didn't look at her. His sharp, unyielding jawline remained locked as he stared out the rain-streaked glass. "The Lord commands us to defend the helpless, Marcus, even when they walk in the garments of the deviant." "The name is Evangeline," she countered, her voice dropping an octave, turning into pure steel. "And the only thing helpless in this car is the man who used to own your world." The clinic was hidden behind a storefront on St. Philip Street that sold herbal remedies and white candles. Dr. Charles, a quiet black physician who had spent a decade patching up the survivors of the quarter's proxy wars, work beneath the hum of a single fluorescent bulb. The air smelled of sulfur, wet earth, and industrial alcohol. Evangeline stood against the tiled wall, watching the crimson water spiral down the sink basin as Dr. Charles cut away Julian's expensive clothes. "The blade touched the pleural lining, Evangeline," Dr. Charles murmured, his tired eyes meeting hers through the reflection of the glass cabinets. "He's drowning in his own blood. I can give him hours, maybe a day. But Julian Vane isn't going to see the weekend." The door to the back room groaned open, and Martha St. James stepped into the sterile light. Her small hands were twisting the hem of her damp wool shawl into tight, defensive knots, her smooth, dark brown skin looking drawn and frail. She had followed Silas from the outer rim of the 9th Ward, drawn into the vortex of her child's dangerous new kingdom. She stopped 3 feet from Evangeline, her eyes traveling down the length of the blood-stained emerald silk gown. "I prayed for you, child," Martha whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the fluorescent light. "Every night since the funeral we held in our hearts, I prayed the devil would release his grip on my boy." "The devil didn't cast me out into the mud, Ma," Evangeline said, her eyes flashing with a dangerous, ancient fire. "Silas did. And you closed the curtains so you wouldn't have to watch the canvas burn." By midnight, the storm outside had settled into a steady, suffocating mist. Julian opened his eyes, the glassy haze of the morphine clearing for a final, structural moment of absolute lucidity. He reached out, his trembling fingers searching the air until Evangeline caught them, wrapping her long hands around his fading warmth. "The St. James Trust," Julian whispered, his breathing shallow and mechanical. "The routing numbers. They're memorized in the back of the ledger on my desk. It's all yours, Eva. The freighters from Caracas, the quarter clubs, the politicians' accounts. You take the crown, or Leo will turn this city into a graveyard for our people." "I don't want an empire of blood, Julian," she whispered back, a single tear tracking down her mahogany cheek, catching the amber light of the oil lantern. "You don't have a choice, my beautiful girl," Julian choked out, his chest hitching. "In New Orleans, if you aren't the one holding the whip, you're the one on the block." Inside a leather booth at the Crescent City Lounge, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of stale tobacco and cold bourbon. Leo Moretti sat opposite Captain Raymond Vance, his face half hidden by the gray haze of his cigar smoke. His linen trousers were pristine, but his shoulders were rigid with an explosive, calculating fury. "Julian is finished," Leo hissed, tapping a stack of falsified customs manifests against the marble table. "The freak has him stashed somewhere in the Tremé, and Grady is guarding the door. If we don't freeze the St. James Trust accounts before she gets the routing codes, the South American distribution lines belong to a black woman who used to be a preacher's boy." Captain Vance smiled, a cold, humorless smile, his fingers tracing the silver badge on his chest. "My boys are already setting the trap, Leo. We don't need a grand jury. We'll declare the Tremé safe house a public hazard and burn it to the bedrock." Silas stood in the center of the Hidden Clinic's waiting area, his King James Bible clutched to his ribs like a shield against the luxury cars parked on the street outside. Evangeline walked out of the treatment room, the heels of her patent leather shoes clicking with a sharp structural authority that broke the silence. "You should leave, Silas," she said quietly. Leo's runners are looking for this place. If they find you here, your Bible won't stop the lead." Silas turned his cold, authoritarian eyes on her, his unyielding jawline tightening. "I saved your life tonight, Marcus." "You saved a ghost," Evangeline countered, stepping closer until her 6-foot frame cast a shadow over him. "Let's get the ledger straight, Papa. I bought the land your St. James Baptist Church sits on last Tuesday. I bought the mortgage on the house you and Martha sleep in. If you want to keep preaching righteousness from that pulpit, you will do it with my explicit permission. You don't have a son anymore. You have a landlord." The kitchen of the Rampart Street shotgun house had been transformed into a tactical war room. Trixie stood behind the linoleum counter, her towering lacquered updo catching the dim yellow light as she handed out plastic cups of ice water to 4 younger trans women who were cowering near the sewing machine. The scent of sweet shea butter was entirely overwhelmed by the metallic smell of Grady cleaning his revolver at the dining table. "The girls can't go down Bourbon Street tonight, Eva," Trixie said, her brassy rasp tight with fear as Evangeline entered the room. "Vance's precinct boys are arresting anyone in a dress. They're calling it a vice sweep, but they're looking for you. They want the ledger keys." Evangeline looked down at her hands, the blood of Julian Vane dried beneath her nails. "Then we stop hiding in the basement, Trixie. If Leo wants a war for the quarter, I'll show him how a St. James handles a collection plate." Back at the hidden clinic, the fluorescent bulb above Julian's bed began to flicker with a high-pitched mechanical hum that resembled a flat line. Julian's fingers were growing cold, his eyes staring unblinkingly at the water-stained acoustic tiles of the ceiling. Evangeline sat by his side, her emerald silk dress wrinkled and damp from the perpetual humidity. "Let them be loud, Ava," Julian whispered, his voice a fading breath of wind over the bayou. Don't let them make you small. You are the new queen." With a final ragged gasp, Julian's chest collapsed inward, his body going completely limp against the white sheets. Evangeline closed her eyes, pressing her forehead against his cold hand as the structural weight of an entire criminal empire dropped squarely onto her mahogany shoulders. "He's gone, boss," Grady growled from the doorway, his massive hand resting on the frame of his weapon. Outside, the distant rhythmic wail of police sirens began to rise over the sound of the rain, accompanied by the harsh, metallic screech of tires turning onto St. Philip Street. Evangeline rose to her full height, her face hardening into an expression of absolute, steely resolve. She reached into Julian's leather jacket, pulling out the gold-embossed ledger that contained the routing codes to the St. James Trust. "Wrap him up, Grady. We don't leave his body for Vance's wolves to mock." Before Grady could move, the front frosted glass window of the herbalist shop shattered inward with a deafening crash. A brilliant, blinding flare of orange light exploded through the room as a Molotov cocktail connected with the wooden floorboards, the fire immediately feeding on the dried herbs and alcohol bottles. Thick, black chemical smoke began to pour through the vents, turning the hidden clinic into a suffocating kiln. "Leo's boys!" Trixie screamed from the rear corridor, her canary yellow trench coat blackened by soot as she dragged Martha toward the back exit. "The alleyway is blocked by unmarked cruisers. They're burning us out." Evangeline navigated the blinding smoke of the corridor, the gold ledger tucked securely against her ribs. Through the orange haze of the fire, she saw Silas standing in the waiting room, his shotgun raised toward a silhouette framed by the burning entrance. It was one of Leo Moretti's lead enforcers, an automatic weapon leveled at the preacher's chest. "Drop the iron, old man!" the enforcer shouted over the roar of the flames. "Give us the ledger or burn with the freak!" Silas didn't lower the barrel. His eyes were wide, with theological terror, his jaw rigid. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death," he began to pray aloud, his voice cracking. A sharp, deafening crack shattered the enforcer's sentence before he could fire. Grady had stepped out from the smoke behind him, his massive revolver emitting a plume of white fire. The enforcer collapsed forward into the burning debris of the herbalist shop, his weapon clattering against the charred linoleum floorboards. "Pray later, preacher," Grady barked, grabbing Silas by his starched collar and dragging him violently toward the rear storage door. "Move your feet, or meet your maker tonight." The rear alleyway of the Tremé district was a vortex of rain and flashing light. Evangeline led the convoy, her emerald green silk gown ruined, her feet bare against the wet, buckled asphalt as she pushed Martha into the rear seat of the remaining black sedan. Behind them, the storefront on St. Philip Street was completely engulfed in a towering pillar of orange flame, the black smoke rising toward the stormy sky like a twisted cathedral spire. "Where are we going, Eva?" Trixie cried out, her lacquered updo partially melted by the heat as the car engine roared to life. "Deep," Evangeline said, her dark eyes reflecting the fire with a cold, terrifying light. "Where the NOPD badges don't buy protection. We're going to the swamp." The black sedan cut its engines near an abandoned fishing shack 30 miles outside the city limits, where the black water of the bayou lapped rhythmically against rotten wooden stilts. The air here was heavy, smelling of sulfur, wet earth, and the ancient iron of the marsh. Gray moss hung from the cypress trees like weeping shrouds. Grady carried Julian's body into the shack, laying him gently across a rusted bait table beneath a single flickering oil lantern. Silas sat on a wooden crate in the corner, his head bowed into his large hands, his pride completely hollowed out by the fire. Martha stepped over to Evangeline, who was standing by the screen door, looking out at the whispering swamp. Slowly, with fingers that no longer twisted her apron in anxiety, Martha reached out. Her hand brushed against Evangeline's mahogany cheek, feeling the soft texture of her skin and the steely framework underneath. "You look like your Aunt Henrietta, Evangeline," Martha whispered, using her true name for the first time in the history of the parish. She had that same fire in her eyes when the flood came in '65. She didn't bow her head either. Evangeline closed her eyes for a brief second, the ghost of Marcus St. James finally settling into the mud of the past. "Thank you, Ma." Evangeline opened the gold-embossed ledger under the amber light of the oil lantern. Her long fingers traced the columns of numbers, the architecture of a global distribution network, the names of judges, the offshore routing numbers in Grand Cayman. She looked at Grady, who stood stoically beside the bait table, his knuckles white. "Leo thinks he left me in ruins," Evangeline said, her slow contralto voice ringing out clearly through the shack. "But he forgot that a St. James knows how to build out of the dust. Grady, call the boat captains. Tell them the St. James Trust is under new management." The episode ends in the French Quarter, where the neon lights of the Crescent City Lounge reflect off the glossy black boots of Leo Moretti as he steps out into the rain. Behind him, Captain Vance is loading a crate of automatic weapons into the rear of an unmarked NOPD van. Leo looks directly out into the storm, a cruel, predatory grin spreading across his sharp features as he clicks a fresh magazine into his pistol. "She's hiding in the marsh, Captain. Gather the boys. We're going alligator hunting."